It was a quiet evening when Greg first noticed something strange. The kind of evening where the world outside seemed too still. The kind where every small creak and groan of the house felt exaggerated, as if the building itself was alive. Greg had lived in his home for over a decade, and nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary. Until tonight. He was down in the basement, sorting through boxes of old memories, things he'd shoved away in corners and forgotten over the years. His hands brushed over dusty photo albums, old tools and forgotten relics of a life lived long ago. But something caught his eye. A door. It wasn't there before. At least, he was certain it wasn't. Greg stepped back, blinking in disbelief. The basement was dimly lit, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Yet, there it was, an old weathered door, standing in the middle of the far wall, where no door had ever existed. Its wooden frame was cracked, and the paint chipped, revealing the raw wood beneath. The handle was rusted, as though it had been untouched for decades. He stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Had he simply missed it over the years? Was it some sort of forgotten part of the house? His heart began to race. The silence around him deepened, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. A chill crept through his body. Despite the warmth of the basement, compelled by an unsettling mix of curiosity and fear, Greg approached the door. His fingers brushed against the cool, cracked surface of the wood. He hesitated for a moment. It was almost as if the door was waiting for him. He turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges protesting, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. Greg braced himself, unsure what he might find. But the room beyond the door wasn't what he expected. It wasn't another part of the basement. It wasn't even a part of the house. The air in front of him was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and a faint, unmistakable smell of decay. Through the door was a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch infinitely, its walls lined with what appeared to be ancient stone. The ground was uneven, with cracked tiles and stones jutting out at odd angles. And as Greg stepped forward, the temperature seemed to drop, the very air around him growing colder. The strangest part, however, was the light, or rather, the lack of it. The hallway ahead was dark, so dark it felt like the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. There was no logical explanation for it. No way this corridor could exist in his basement. Greg stood frozen, staring into the abyss of the unknown, his pulse pounding in his ears. A strange, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. It was faint at first, like the rustling of something, or someone moving in the distance. Greg felt an overwhelming urge to step forward, despite the growing fear that gnawed his insides. There was no turning back now. He had to know. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the corridor. The door behind him slammed shut. Greg's breath quickened as the door behind him slammed shut with a force that made the entire basement shake. The sudden loud noise startled him, but it was the eerie silence that followed that made his heart pound in his chest. The hallway in front of him was dark, too dark for any basement space to feel natural. The stone walls felt ancient, their surfaces covered with moss and small patches of fungus, as though this place had not seen light or life for centuries. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to find a way to open the door again and escape to the familiarity of his home. But something deeper within him, something darker, tugged at his curiosity. The hallway ahead beckoned, whispering in a way that didn't quite reach his ears, but resonated deep within his mind. He took another step. The cold air around him seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as though something unseen was moving in the shadows, watching him. His footsteps echoed unnaturally against the stone floor, too loud in the thick silence. The faint rustling sound from earlier continued, growing ever so slightly more pronounced, as if something or someone was just out of sight, moving just beyond his reach. Greg turned his head, trying to make out anything in the darkness, but the shadows were thick, impenetrable. There were no visible doors, no windows. The hallway stretched endlessly, as far as he could see, with no end in sight. The further he walked, the more disorienting it became. The air grew thicker, heavier, and his breath came out in visible puffs of cold, even though the basement above should have been warm. Suddenly, his foot hit something on the floor. He looked down. It was a stone, jagged and uneven, almost like it had been intentionally placed there to trip him. He crouched to pick it up, his fingers grazing the rough surface. As he did, something caught his eye, a small, faded symbol carved into the stone, hidden beneath the moss. Greg's heart skipped a beat. It was an intricate design, resembling an ancient rune he couldn't recognize, but its meaning felt ominously familiar. His mind raced, trying to place it, but the more he thought about it, the further away the memory seemed. He let the stone fall from his hand, unable to tear his gaze away from the symbol. The rustling sound grew louder, sharper, until it was no longer just a faint whisper. It was close, too close. He could feel it now, a presence lurking just behind him. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless hallway behind him. His nerves were on edge, every instinct warning him to leave, to turn back to the door he'd come through. But something held him in place. Something deep inside told him that whatever was waiting in this twisted space was something he needed to face. And then, the floor beneath his feet began to shift. It wasn't a tremor or the settling of the house. It was deliberate, as though something far beneath the earth was stirring, something ancient and alive. The walls seemed to groan in protest as the entire corridor seemed to move with him, warping and twisting as if the hallway itself was alive. Greg's eyes widened in panic. He didn't understand what was happening, but the sensation of an unseen force pulling at him grew stronger with each passing second. The air grew colder, and a new sound began to reverberate through the stone walls, a low, guttural hum that made his teeth ache. In that moment, Greg realized the truth. The hallway didn't want him to leave. It wanted him to stay. And as the floor shifted again, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being drawn deeper into its depths. The door was long gone. There was no going back now. As Greg's feet carried him further down the shifting corridor, the temperature continued to plummet. His breath came out in sharp, misty clouds that dissolved almost instantly in the oppressive cold. The low hum, a pulsating sound, seemed to throb from the very walls, vibrating through his bones, filling his chest with dread. Every step forward felt like he was being pulled into the very fabric of this nightmare. The further he went, the more unnatural the place felt, like a nightmare with no escape, a place that had no business existing. The corridor curved, its walls narrowing, forcing him into an ever tighter passage. He could feel the weight of something ancient pressing against him from all sides, a suffocating force that seemed to feed on his fear. His pulse raced in his ears, but the sound of his heartbeat was drowned out by the increasingly loud hum, a sound that felt alive, hungry. And then, a faint whisper reached his ears. It was soft at first, just a murmur on the edge of his consciousness, so faint that he thought it was his imagination. But as he strained his ears, the words became clearer, the voice growing louder, like an echo from a far-off memory. The voice was pleading. No, it was begging. "Help me?" Greg froze, his body tense, every hair on the back of his neck standing at attention. The voice seemed to come from nowhere, yet everywhere. His eyes darted around, searching the stone walls, the shadows that stretched impossibly long. But there was nothing. No one. He took another step forward, his legs trembling, and the whispering grew louder. It was as though the voice was coming from the very walls themselves. He could feel it vibrating through his chest, the urgency and desperation unmistakable. "Please help me." Greg's heart pounded. He had to know who was calling out to him. Was it someone who had been trapped in this place for centuries? Or was it something more sinister? Something that wanted to lure him deeper into the maze of this cursed corridor? A flicker of movement caught his eye. In the darkness, just at the edge of his vision, a shadowy figure appeared, slender and tall, but indistinct, as if the darkness itself had shaped it into existence. It moved with an unnatural, jerking motion, its limbs twitching in a way that was almost inhuman. The figure drifted along the walls, disappearing before Greg could get a clear look. The sound of the whispering grew frantic, and Greg felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to move forward. The air thickened, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of unseen eyes watching his every step. He was no longer alone. He could feel the presence of something that had been waiting for him, watching him since he'd stepped through that door. His hands were cold as he reached out to touch the nearest wall, his fingers grazing the rough, wet stone. As he did, he noticed something strange: scratches. Deep, jagged marks marred the surface of the wall, as if something or someone had been desperately trying to escape. The longer he stared at the scratches, the more he felt the pull, a force urging him to follow, to press forward into the abyss. And then the whispers stopped. Suddenly, an eerie silence fell over the corridor. Greg's breathing echoed unnervingly loud in the stillness. The absence of the hum made the atmosphere even more oppressive, like a storm waiting to break. He took a deep breath, bracing himself. The path ahead seemed to stretch out endlessly. The darkness was so thick now, he could almost taste it in the air. Every part of him screamed to turn back, to escape this place, but the strange pull was stronger than ever. He wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. Then, in the far distance, a dim light flickered. Greg's heart skipped a beat. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, far down the hallway, just beyond the bend. The light seemed to beckon him. Without thinking, he started moving again. Each step took him closer to that flickering glow. With each step, the temperature dropped even further, the air growing colder, heavier. He was close. He had to be. But as he approached, the light grew dimmer, flickering erratically, as though it were fighting against some unseen force. Greg's pulse quickened, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. He wasn't just walking toward a light. He was walking towards something that shouldn't exist. As Greg approached the flickering light, an unsettling sense of inevitability washed over him. It was as though the hallway itself was drawing him in, making him a part of its twisted design. Each step forward felt like he was being drawn deeper into a nightmare, a place where logic no longer applied, where time and space had warped into something unrecognizable. The light ahead grew brighter, but it remained distant, flickering as if fighting against the thick shadows that pressed in from all sides. Greg's mind raced, every rational thought telling him to turn back, but his body refused to obey. The pull of the light was too strong, too enticing. He had to reach it. Finally, he rounded the bend and stepped into a large, open space. It was a room, but not like any room he had ever seen. The walls were jagged, uneven, covered in moss and strange symbols that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness, and the floor beneath his feet was slick with something wet and unnatural. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of rot, and something else, something metallic like blood. At the center of the room, the source of the light stood, an ornate stone pedestal. On it, an object was bathed in the flickering glow, casting long, haunting shadows against the walls. The object itself was covered in strange runes, etched deeply into its surface, glowing faintly with otherworldly light. It looked ancient, too ancient for anything from this world. It was as if time itself had forgotten this place, leaving only the relic behind. Greg's breath caught in his throat as he took a step closer, drawn inexplicably to the pedestal. The light flickered again, and for a moment, the room seemed to shift, distort, as though it were a mirage, something that wasn't meant to exist. His mind screamed for him to stop, to turn away, but his body betrayed him. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the object. The moment his fingers made contact, the room around him seemed to come alive. The walls groaned as though in pain. The symbols on the surface of the stone pulsed with an eerie energy, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that Greg's breath turned to ice. Suddenly, the whispers returned, but now, they were no longer distant. They were right behind him, swirling around him, crashing against his ears with an intensity that made his head spin. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were screams, pleas, and desperate cries for help. Leave, leave, don't touch it. Help, help, it's too late. The voices overlapped, growing louder, more frantic, until Greg felt like his mind might shatter under pressure. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just a cold, empty room and the pulsing stone pedestal. But that wasn't all. As the voices screamed, the shadows and corners of the room began to move, undulating, twisting, as though something was awakening in the darkness. The very air around Greg seemed to vibrate with a strange, unsettling energy. His heart raced, his chest tight with panic. This wasn't just a hallway. This wasn't just a basement. He had crossed into something far worse. Something ancient, a place where time and space didn't function as they should. This room, this object, it wasn't meant for anyone to find. And now that he had touched it, it was as if he had unleashed something. A loud crash echoed from behind him, and Greg spun around in terror. The shadows were closing in, growing more dense, more tangible. There was no way out. The hallway had disappeared. The door was gone. He was trapped in this twisted, unnatural space. And whatever force governed was waking up, aware of his presence. The pedestal, now pulsing violently with energy, began to crack. The symbols on its surface twisted, glowing brighter, more erratic. The ground trembled beneath Greg's feet, and for a moment, the air was so thick with pressure that he could barely breathe. Something was rising from the depths of the earth, something that had been dormant for far too long, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Greg turned to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as though the room itself had seized him, holding him in place with an unseen force. His mind raced, panic overtaking him, as the shadows in the room shifted and coalesced into shapes. Figures, distorted and twisted, their faces obscured by darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, now all around him, as if the very walls were closing in. "Help us, save us." And then, in the distance, Greg heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, coming from the depths of the room. Something was coming, and it wasn't human. It was too late. There was no escape. The shadows had found him. The growl echoed through the room, deep and guttural, reverberating off the jagged stone walls with an unnatural force. Greg's heart thudded in his chest, each beat growing heavier, faster, as the room seemed to close in on him. He tried to scream, to run, but his legs were frozen, locked in place by some unseen force. The shadows around him flickered, warping into more distinct shapes. Humanoid figures, their bodies twisted and distorted, their faces obscured by darkness, their forms flickering like the last remnants of a dying flame. The growl grew louder, more distinct, as if it were a warning. A creature emerging from the depths of this cursed place, drawn to him by the very touch of the relic. It was a sound that reverberated through his bones, primal and terrifying. It was as if the ground beneath him was shaking, as if the very earth had been disturbed, calling forth something ancient, something monstrous that had been hidden away for centuries. Greg's breath came out in ragged gasps. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the terror clouded his thoughts. The pedestal at the center of the room continued to pulse, the symbols now glowing fiercely, casting eerie, unnatural light that seemed to twist and distort the very shadows. He knew, deep down, that whatever had been awakened by his touch was not something of this world. It was something ancient, something beyond comprehension. The shadows seemed to draw closer, their forms becoming clearer, more tangible. The growl was no longer distant. It was right behind him now, so close that he could feel the cold breath on the back of his neck. He dared not turn around, terrified of what he might see. His body shook uncontrollably. But the fear wasn't just from the presence of the shadows. It was something deeper, something far older. It was a realization that he had opened a door that should never have been opened. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, a voice broke through the chaos, a whisper so faint, so fragile, that he almost missed it. "Run." Greg's eyes widened, his pulse racing as the voice cut through the thick fog of fear. He turned his head, scanning the room, but there was nothing, no one. The shadows were closer now, their movements almost like whispers themselves, flickering in and out of existence. Run before it's too late. The voice, though soft, was clear, and this time, Greg recognized it. It wasn't just a random whisper in the dark. It was a voice he knew. It was a voice of someone he had once loved, someone he had lost long ago, a voice that had been silenced by time and fate. In that moment, a surge of adrenaline coursed through Greg's veins. His legs, still shaking, finally obeyed him. He forced himself to turn away from the pedestal and sprint toward the farthest corner of the room, his heart hammering in his chest. The growl echoed again, louder this time, the sound of something hunting him, drawing closer with each frantic step. But Greg didn't dare look back. He couldn't. He ran. The room seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls warping and shifting with every step he took. The floor was uneven, slick with moisture, causing him to stumble. But he pushed forward, his breath ragged and desperate. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to escape, to find a way out. But the hallway he had come from had vanished, replaced by an endless maze of twisting corridors and dark shadows. And then, as if the very air conspired against him, the light ahead flickered out. For a moment, Greg was swallowed by darkness, his surroundings disorienting and claustrophobic. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, trying to find something, anything to guide him. His breath echoed in the silence, the only sound in the black void. His eyes strained to adjust, but there was nothing. No light, no point of reference, just the oppressive weight of the dark that seemed to choke the very life out of him. And then, as if the darkness itself was alive, he heard it. The growl again, closer now, almost upon him. Greg's chest tightened, and for the first time since he had entered this cursed place, he felt the overwhelming sense that he wasn't alone. Not in any human sense. There was something else here, something far older and far darker than anything he could comprehend. It wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a trap, and he had walked straight into it. The growl turned into a roar, deafening, filling the empty space. The floor beneath his feet cracked, and the walls around him began to tremble. Something was breaking through, something that had been waiting. And in the next instant, the light flickered back to life, faint, distant, but undeniable. Greg didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the light, his heart racing as he fought against the terror threatening to overwhelm him. The shadows surged, reaching for him, but the light grew brighter with every step he took. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The light was closer now, so close he could almost feel its warmth, almost taste the promise of escape. And then, just as the shadows lunged, just as the growl reached a crescendo, the light enveloped him completely. The room, the corridor, the growl, they all vanished. Greg found himself standing in his basement, gasping for breath, his hands trembling, his heart still pounding in his chest. The door he had walked through was gone. The pedestal was gone. The shadows, the whispers, the growl, all of it was gone. But the weight of the experience lingered, pressing down on him, a reminder that whatever had been awakened in that dark place had not been vanquished. It was still there, waiting, watching. And as he turned to leave the basement, his eyes caught something on the floor, a small cracked stone, the same stone he had seen earlier, the one with the strange rune. It had fallen from his pocket. He picked it up, his fingers trembling. The symbol on the stone was still glowing faintly. It wasn't over. Not yet.